Okay, everybody, today we're going to talk about the lymphatic system and the immune system. I'm doing this in two sections, so I'm going to get to about slide number 80-ish, give or take, and then go. Let me make this full screen and we will get going on it. Well, let me try to make it full screen. Okay, here we go. So keep in mind, part of the lymphatic system and the immune system is to get rid of invaders. That could be microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, parasites, viruses, et cetera, et cetera. The main source of human disease, or one of the main sources at least, would be bacteria. Not all bacterial cells are harmful to human beings. Some are beneficial, and they're called non-pathogenic, and the ones that cause disease are called pathogenic bacteria. Immune system itself isn't an organ system, but it's different cells scattered throughout the body that perform different functions. So part of this system, the immune/lymphatic system, is to collect water that comes out of the capillaries and return it to the circulation. It also will be on the lookout for invasive bacteria, pathogenic bacteria that can cause harm to a human being, as well as your immune system. So the main cell of the immune system is the lymphocyte. It's one of the agranulocytic white blood cells. So here, let me see if I can circle. Yeah, right, that was easy to pick out. Here we have a lymphocyte sitting there among other cells, this one and this one and this one and this one and this one. What are those other cells? Erythrocytes are red blood cells. So if you look at the lymphocyte, there's a lot of nucleus, not a lot of cytoplasm, and there are no granules within the cytoplasm, so it's agranulocytic. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils are the granulocytic. White blood cells or leukocytes, lymphocytes and monocytes are the agranulocytic cells. Okay. The lymphatic system, it's like the circulatory system in a sense, but it's different in some very, very important ways. The circulatory system is a closed system. You could trace a red blood cell and you could trace its path through the body, its return to the heart, it getting sent up to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart, and then circulating again. There's essentially no beginning or end to it. The lymphatic system actually has a beginning and it has an end. When capillaries are at the level of the tissue, at the level of the cells, they provide fluid to that cell. And some of that fluid needs to be taken back up, and the capillaries do a really, really good job of it. However, they don't do a perfect job. The fluid that's left behind in excess of what we need gets reabsorbed by lymphatic capillaries. And about 15%, 2 to 4 liters a day, which is, a half to 1 gallon of all the water that the body uses enters the lymphatic system and gets returned to the blood. In terms of immunity, that's something we talk about with regard to the immune system, obviously. And it picks up, the system picks up foreign cells, it identifies them as such, and starts an immune response, an attack on these foreign invading cells. Also, lipid absorption. Lipids are kind of large molecules. It'd be very, very hard for them to pass through the walls of a capillary. And don't forget, the cardiovascular system is completely closed. Yes, small molecules can pass in and out through the capillaries because they're only one cell layer thick, but large molecules can't. So how do we get lipids or fats into our circulation? Well, the lymphatic system does that. It picks up the fats that we digest from the intestinal tract, delivers them into the bloodstream, and then we can send these fats, which, we think of them as bad, but they are essential nutrients, deliver these fats to other portions of the body. The circulatory system contains blood. There is the formed elements. That's the aspect, one aspect of it. The red cells, the white cells, the platelets, and then the acellular portion of blood is called the plasma. The lymphatic system doesn't contain blood. It contains a fluid called lymph, L-Y-M-P-H. And what the lymphatic vessels do is they transport this lymph and everything that's contained with it, transport it from one place in the body, and eventually it'll dump it into the circulatory system. It passes through various checkpoints along the way, and we'll discuss that. So what is lymph? It's fairly clear and colorless, but has less protein than we'll find in plasma, the liquid portion of blood. And it starts out as excess extracellular fluid, fluid that's not contained by the cell walls but are outside the cell boundaries. They call that extracellular fluid. It's also called interstitial fluid. So we have lymphatic capillaries, the smallest lymph vessels in the lymphatic system. We find them in just about every tissue of the body. With some exceptions, we don't find them in bone marrow. We don't find them in any portion of the bone. We don't see them in cartilage. We don't see them in the cornea, which, if you recall, is the outer surface of the eye, that clear membranous layer right in front. Okay. And lymphatic capillaries have cells that overlap each other. They are closed at one end. Okay. Another thing about lymphatic vessels, they have valves in them, just like veins have valves in them. And that helps to move the fluid from the lower portions of the body through the lymphatic system to the higher portions of the body, because they're fighting gravity. So let's look at the interplay between cells, the blood vessels, and the lymphatic vessels. So here we have an arteriole, contains oxygenated blood. Then it turns into, I'll just underline the whole thing, a capillary, right? I'll kind of bracket it. The capillary is between an arteriole on one end and a venule on the other end. Arteriole is the smallest division of arteries. Venules are the smallest divisions of veins. So in between there, you can see that there are numerous cells. This could be cells of any portion of the body. Those green structures are lymphatic capillaries. There's a beginning, which we see, and take my word for it, there is an end to it. So at the ends of these lymphatic capillaries, or if you want to call it the beginning, might be a better term, excess extracellular fluid, excess interstitial fluid can be picked up by these lymphatic capillaries. The blood capillaries don't recover all of the fluid, so the lymphatic capillaries do that. And these lymphatic capillaries, follow the pointer, will kind of merge from smaller ones into larger ones and larger ones, et cetera, okay? So again, we have arterioles, turning into capillaries. Capillaries are blood vessels, one cell layer thick. Things can pass in and out of the capillaries, not everything. And the capillaries, one of their jobs is to pick up the excess extracellular fluid. However, they leave some fluid behind. If we left all that fluid behind, we'd get very, very swollen. So lymphatic capillaries help pick up the remainder of that extra cellular fluid that's been left behind. Okay. So here's another depiction of it. These obviously are cells with the nucleus, right? And in between the cells, like here and here, And let's say here, just to name a few, is the extracellular space or interstitial space. Okay, right in the middle is a big green lymphatic capillary. What flows through there? Tissue, a fluid rather, called lymph. And there are some filaments that anchor the lymphatic vessels to the tissue. So they're tethered down and they can stay in place. Lymphatic vessels, the smaller ones, have only one layer. That's the endothelium. The larger ones, 3 layers. The internal layer of the 3 is called the tunica interna. That's endothelium and valves. Tunica media is the middle layer, elastic fibers and smooth muscle fibers. And the tunica externa is a thin outer protective layer. As I said earlier, these smaller lymphatic capillaries merge into larger lymphatic vessels. A lot of these lymphatic vessels, as they find their way through the body, they pass through many lymph nodes. And you probably have an idea what lymph nodes are. You ever go to the doctor and he or she touches your neck and they say they're checking for swollen glands. Glands is really the layman's term for lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic and immune system. Okay, as I said earlier, there are valves in lymphatic vessels, and that helps keep the movement of lymph going in a direction back towards the chest. And for the lower half of the body, it actually has to fight gravity. So the lymph vessels have these valves that prevent the lymph fluid, or lymph as I might call it from here on in, from just sinking downward, so we get swollen feet. So the vessels help the valves help take care of that. In the body, there are lymphatic trunks, and they drain large portions of the body. We'll go over them. Here are the names, and you can read it yourself: jugular, subclavian, bronchomediastinal, intercostal, etc., etc. And then there are 2 large collecting ducts. The right lymphatic duct really takes care of the right arm, the right side of the head, chest, and it empties into a large vein called the subclavian vein. Don't forget, the collarbone is the clavicle. Sub means underneath, so the subclavian vein is a large vessel right underneath the collarbone or clavicle. The larger of the other collecting ducts would be the thoracic duct. It covers every portion of the body that the right lymphatic duct does not cover. So here's what the thoracic duct covers. It's best to remember what the right lymphatic duct covers, and anything else is the thoracic duct. Okay. And the right lymphatic duct drains eventually into the circulatory system, into the right subclavian vein. The thoracic duct again drains into the circulatory system, into the left subclavian vein. So in yellow is a picture of the thoracic duct. The beginning of the thoracic duct is in the abdomen. The term for this sac here, where it starts, is called the cisterna chyli. So that's if you want to say there's a beginning to it, it's the cisterna chyli in the abdomen. Okay, so if we're looking at fluid exchange, we see the over here, we see the circulatory system and the lymphatic system superimposed on one another. There is a beginning to the lymphatic system and an end to the lymphatic system. For the circulatory system, it's a closed loop. Okay. The 2 major drains of the lymphatic system: the collecting duct will drain into the right subclavian vein. The thoracic duct drains into the left subclavian vein. Over here you see all the a diagram, a depiction of all the lymphatic vessels in the body, and all of these green dots here and there and there and everywhere. Those are lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes occur in cluster. You have cervical lymph nodes in the neck, and you have mediastinal nodes in the mediastinum, the area in the thoracic cavity between the right pleural cavity and the left pleural cavity. This in-between section is the mediastinum. And we have mediastinal nodes there, and we also have, as the largest structure in the mediastinum, would be the heart. Okay, so here's a depiction of the lymphatics of the right thoracic region. Okay, we have lymph vessels and lymph nodes in the breast. In the armpit area, we have axillary lymph nodes. Axillary is the polite word for armpit. And as a lymph goes along through its path up these lymphatic vessels, it'll pass through lymph nodes, where the body will inspect it for bacteria, will inspect it for cancer cells and things like that. One thing to note is that when a cancer is present in one part of the body, and here we'll look at breast cancer because that's what the diagram lends itself to, the first place that the doctors check to see if it's spread would be the local lymph nodes. Okay, so those are very, very important. It's a different prognosis of a cancer, whether it exists just locally, meaning in the tissue. The tissue could be the breast, or it could be the colon, or it could be the kidney, whatever. Then a second degree of severity would be, did it spread to lymph nodes, and so on and so forth. In terms of the drainage of the lymphatic system, I mentioned this earlier. The right lymphatic duct will drain into the right subclavian vein, and then the thoracic duct, which is larger and encompasses more of the body, will drain into the left subclavian vein. So dumps directly into the circulatory system. The way lymph makes its way up to the thorax is the same way that blood makes its way up to the thorax from the veins. One difference is there's a pump pushing things along in the circulatory system. There's no pump in the lymphatic system. So when the lymphatic vessels contract, that helps push the lymph along, and the valves, which will open to allow the lymph to go up and then close so it doesn't fall back down, that helps as well. When we take a deep breath in, we lower the pressure in our chest, in our thorax, where the subclavian veins are, and that helps drive the return of the lymph as well. Hold on for 1 second. Okay, so that's some of the ways that helps lymph flow along. There are other things that help lymph flow along as well. When our skeletal muscles contract, particularly the ones in the lower extremity, because don't forget, you have to fight gravity to take that upward. So that helps. When arteries pulsate, they help squeeze the lymph vessels along. And exercise, right? So you have the arteries pumping, the muscles contracting, taking deep breaths, decreasing the pressure in the chest, making the fluid more likely to go from high pressure to low pressure. That helps it along. There are lymphatic cells, right? And we're talking right now about lymphocytes, subclasses of lymphocytes, okay? They're NK cells, natural killer cells. What they do is they identify and attack bacteria. They're also the cells that will make our body reject foreign transplanted tissue, okay? And they'll also help to kill our own cells that have turned cancerous. Obviously not perfectly, or else no one would get cancer, but that's what they do. There are T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, right? T lymphocytes are given that name because they mature in the thymus, an organ in the mediastinum, right? That portion of thoracic cavity between the left pleural cavity and the right pleural cavity. The largest organ structure in there is the heart, but the thymus is there as well. Pretty large, pretty significant in newborns, and it shrivels up or shrinks as we get older. T lymphocytes. There is another class of lymphocytes called B lymphocytes. These are the ones that will produce antibodies. What are antibodies? These are proteins produced by the immune system that identify, target, and attack foreign invaders. So the lymphocytes do these sorts of things. Natural killer cells, T lymphocytes, and B lymphocytes so far. We also have macrophages or macrophages. You'll hear both terms used. And these are phagocytic cells. Phago means to eat, cytic means cells. So these are cell-eating cells. They start out life as monocytes, right? One of the types of leukocytes or white blood cells. And then they'll mature and change into tissue cells called macrophages. So besides phagocytizing cells, they also will phagocyze tissue debris, leftover junk, dead neutrophils, bacteria, and other foreign substances. They eat it up. They're like Miss Pac-Man for the body. Okay. Monocytes are the largest by size, not by number, of the white blood cells, and they circulate through the blood for 24, 72 hours or so. Then they go into the tissue, and when they leave the circulatory system and go into the tissue, they are called macrophages. Macro means big, phage means to eat. So these are big eating cells. So here's a picture of some bacteria in green and a big old macrophage there. This whole thing here, that big pinkish type of cell is a macrophage. And macrophage is doing what it does, eating bacteria, eating cancer cells, things like that. So we talked about lymph vessels, right? And we talked about how they drain into the right thoracic duct and how it and the thoracic duct and how it empties into the right subclavian vein and left subclavian vein. So we also have some sorts of lymphatic tissue. Some of them are congregated into areas where they're all together, like lymph nodes or glands. There are other lymphatic tissues that are just kind of scattered about the body. We'll talk about most of these, some in more detail, some in less, some will just get a mention, if that. So if we're looking at some of the lymph tissue in the body, such as, just to name a few, the appendix, right lower quadrant, right, comes off the cecum, the first portion of the large intestine, the tonsils in the back of the throat or pharynx, and then lymph nodes, those glands that are scattered throughout the body. We see these things called lymphatic nodules. So right here, this guy right here, kind of looks like a knot in a piece of wood. If you see a wood table and there's a knot there, that's kind of what a lymphatic nodule looks like. We have other lymphatic tissue. I don't want to get into this too much, of various sorts. One type is called Peyer's patches. Okay. All right, the organs of the lymphatic system, they're pretty well demarcated. They're fairly well defined. They usually are surrounded by and enclosed by some connective tissue that make a capsule around it. What are some of the primary and secondary lymphatic organs? Primary lymphatic organs would include the red bone marrow and the thymus. And some of the secondary lymphatic organs would be the lymph nodes and the tonsils and the spleen. The spleen is located in the left upper quadrant of the abdomen. So red bone marrow was where blood is made. The textbook calls it hemopoiesis. A lot of other sources will call it hematopoiesis. It's the same thing. So now, don't forget, if we're talking about the immune system, we're talking about white blood cells, and probably more so than anything else, we're talking about a particular type of white blood cells, lymphocytes. So the bone marrow obviously is directly involved because that's where blood is formed. Okay, we're moving on. Thymus. Thymus is one of those multi-purpose organs. It's in the mediastinum within the thoracic cavity. Thymus is part of the endocrine system, which means it produces a hormone called thymosin. It's also part of the lymphatic system. It's also part of the immune system. As I told you, the thymus is fairly large in the newborn, and then as we get older and older, it shrinks, shrivels. So this is the thoracic cavity. This is the right pleural cavity. This is the left pleural cavity, and this space in between, I'll get rid of the other stuff, is the mediastinum. Obviously, we can see the heart in the mediastinum. The esophagus passes through there. The trachea passes through the mediastinum. We have large blood vessels there, but we also have the thymus. So the thymus has a fibrous capsule. Most of the lymphatic organs do have a capsule. And then it gives off these little separations, little septae that will take the thymus and divide it into lobes. So here's a picture of the thymus. Kind of looks like the thyroid. There's a right lobe, and there's a left lobe. And these little areas within the thymus, they're called lobules. So we're looking on the right, we're looking at a lobule, and we can see that we have the capsule of the thymus on the outside, and then it scoots in to partition off, almost like when you're cutting a pie, to partition off the thymus into different lobules. So the little inturnings of the capsule that make the partition, they're called trabeculae. The thymus has an outer portion called the cortex, and that's from this point here, and then an inner portion called the medulla. A lot of organs have an outer cortex and inner medulla. We'll see that later in this chapter as well. So there we are, we're looking at the thymus, and we can see the capsule, and then the way some of the capsular tissue goes inward, those are trabeculae, and it divides it up into lobules. Outer portion is called the cortex. The inner portion is called the medulla. You can pause this and look at it if you'd like. In this PowerPoint series, what they're calling your attention to, they put in the green shade. Okay. Lymph nodes, your so-called glands. By far, in terms of number, they're the most numerous lymphatic organs. About 500 per person. They do two things. One is they cleanse the lymph. What's the lymph? The lymph is the fluid that circulates through the lymphatic vessels. Similar to plasma, not exactly the same, similar to plasma, but it has less proteins in it. Okay. And lymph nodes cleanses the lymph, and that's also where the B cells and T cells get activated. Just to back you up a bit, the T cells and B cells are subtypes of lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a subtype of leukocytes, and leukocytes meaning white blood cells. So you have leukocytes. What are the 5 types? Neutrophils, eosinophils, eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. Some subcategories of the lymphocytes are T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. So here is a lymph node or gland. Okay. Outer portion in green would be the cortex. The inner portion is the medulla. Okay, within lymph nodes and other lymphatic tissue, you have structures called lymphoid nodules. I said that's kind of like a knot in wood that you'd see if you see a long plank of wood, or you see a wooden table, wooden flooring, whatever, lymphoid nodules. Okay, so we're looking at a lymph node, and there's a lot of reticular fibers. Reticular kind of means like a spider's web. So reticular, spider's web, and in here you can see the reticular fibers of the lymph nodes, right, making their web, and here you can see the lymphocytes in there doing their business. So that's in a lymph node. Don't forget lymph nodes, and I mentioned this in the thymus as well, an outer cortex and inner medulla. When the lymph is moving through the lymphatic vessels, from time to time, it'll have to pass through lymph nodes. So there has to be a way into the lymph nodes, and there has to be a way out of the lymph nodes. Remember from the nervous system, we talked about afferent and efferent, okay? We have afferent lymph vessels that lead into the lymph node. Then we have efferent lymph vessels that exit. Afferent goes at the lymph nodes. So there are afferent lymphatic vessels leading to the lymph nodes, and then there are efferent vessels, 3 of them, that E for exit the lymph nodes. So here's a lymph node. Lymph is flowing in this direction. So we have afferent lymphatic vessels. Okay. Then this lymph fluid gets sent into the lymph node, and the lymph node does what the lymph node does to it. Cleanses the lymph fluid. It will try to handcuff bacteria that might be trapped in there, handcuff cancer cells that are in there. And then once the cleaning process is done, it'll leave through an efferent lymphatic vessel. Okay. So here's the efferent exiting. Here are the afferent vessels entering or going at the lymph node. We have chains of lymph nodes. We have clusters of lymph nodes throughout the body, and we name these lymph node clusters by where they are found. Cervical lymph nodes, they are in the neck. There's a deep cluster of cervical lymph nodes. And then there are superficial, close to the surface ones. When they get swollen, as they will do when they're fighting an infection, or unfortunately, if they're filled up with cancer, they get swollen and feel enlarged and tender and painful. So those are in the neck. The axillary lymph nodes are in the armpit or axilla portion of the body. The thoracic lymph nodes, they're within the thoracic cavity, particularly that subsection right in the middle called the mediastinum. So here we're looking at, in yellow, right, all these things in yellow, and I'll undraw that. Those are mediastinal lymph nodes. How are they different than cervical lymph nodes? They're the same in function, they're the same in structure. We just name them from where they're found. So, for example, if you have cancer of the lungs, you would expect to see it first on a CAT scan or an MRI spreading to the mediastinal lymph nodes, not lymph nodes, let's say down in the groin area or some other place in the body. So mediastinal lymph nodes. You have lymph nodes in the abdomen. You have inguinal lymph nodes, and that's in the groin. Popliteal lymph nodes in the back of the knee. So these lymph nodes are characterized by where they're found. Okay, so if you look at these pictures, the axillary lymph nodes right in the armpit area, inguinal lymph nodes where the upper crease of the leg is, the groin crease, iliac lymph nodes are by the iliac vessels within the pelvis. Okay, we have lymph nodes within the intestinal system, and we name them by where they are. I'm not going to break down the names for you, but just to point out, you can see ileocolic lymph nodes, right? That's in the area where the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, is cut off here, meets the colon. We have inferior mesenteric lymph nodes, et cetera, et cetera. These are lymph nodes that we find in the abdomen. Okay. Right here, we're looking at inguinal lymph nodes, right? Here's the crease when you flex your leg at the hip. And then we have superficial, and we have some deep inguinal lymph nodes. You can see that in this picture, or at least the superficial ones you can see. When a lymph node is working, when it has something to work on, if it's under stress because there's something in the body it doesn't like, we might have a condition called lymphadenitis, right? And these are when your lymph glands or your lymph nodes become painful and swollen because they're working on destroying some sort of foreign invader. When your lymph nodes enlarge, well, it stretches that capsule that surrounds it. Just like when you have a blister on your finger, right, and it's getting bigger and bigger, it's stretching the skin and it hurts more and more. That's what happens when lymph nodes enlarge, lymphadenitis, and it stretches the capsule. Sometimes lymph nodes can be firm and very hard, not necessarily painful. And in general, we call diseases of the lymph nodes lymphadenopathy. Adeno means gland, pathy means disease, lymphadenopathy. Metastases. Well, that's a cancer term, but the immune system is essential in terms of protecting us from cancer. So when a cancer is in one part of the body and it stays there, it's a localized cancer. When it spreads beyond that local area in which it started, they call that metastasizing. So cancerous cells from where that cluster of cancer started break free. Where's one of the first places that they're going to spread to? Well, these cancer cells will get into the lymphatic vessels, and they'll usually get stopped by the first lymph node that they encounter. There's a battle going on. If these cancer cells are not stopped, eradicated, wiped out, they will multiply within the lymph node, destroy the lymph node, and then they'll move to the next place as the lymphatic flow goes. Okay. Just to give you an idea, this is not exact, this is not complete by any means, but if you look at treatment of breast cancer, lumpectomy, that's removal of the cancerous area. Mastectomy, removal of the breast tissue. And when you do those operations, you will remove some, usually not all these days, but you will remove some of the nearby axillary nodes. What you're really checking for more than anything else, you take the axillary nodes, send them out for a biopsy, which means they get sliced up and looked at under the microscope. If there are cancer cells within those lymph nodes, that's a worse prognosis than if those lymph nodes are free and clear of cancer cells. So here's some axillary lymph nodes. Okay. Tonsils, another organ of the lymphatic tissue, back of the throat. And what your tonsils do is help you fight off infections, bacterial infections, viral infections, that sort of thing. But when they're doing that, they tend to get enlarged. Used to be, when I was a kid, tonsils got enlarged, too many strep throats or whatever, they'd get removed. Today, there's much, much less of a tendency to surgically remove tonsils, which is called a tonsillectomy. If tonsils are so big that they're obstructing breathing, or they're so large and just kind of filled up, they're like a big sack, that they get infected frequently, then you might have a tonsillectomy. You don't like to do a tonsillectomy on anyone over the age of 12. You can do it, but there's a high risk of bleeding. When you do a tonsillectomy as a child, it's not so bad. But why remove the tonsils if you don't have to, because it's their job to help keep us free of infection? So tonsillectomy used to be common, not so much anymore. Okay. We have three sets of tonsils. The palatine tonsils, and when people refer to the tonsils, they're talking about the palatine tonsils, and they're in the back of the throat. Lingual tonsils are at the root of the tongue, and then pharyngeal tonsils are also known as adenoids, and that's on the wall of the nasopharynx. So here's a lateral or sideways depiction of the three tonsils. The palatine tonsils, that's what doctors look at when they tell you to say, they look and they see the palatine tonsils. Lingual tonsils are under the tongue, and the pharyngeal tonsils, also known as adenoids. All right, let me. They're in the nasopharynx. So the adenoids or pharyngeal tonsils are here. So here is a micrograph of the tonsils. Okay, palatine tonsil, which tonsil is that? Those are the tonsils. Those tonsils. And we can take a look at that, pause it if you'd like. Lateral view, palatine tonsils, pharyngeal tonsils or adenoids, and we also have the lingual tonsils, and they're at the base of the tongue. So this big muscular structure, that big muscular structure right there, that's the tongue. Spleen, that's the largest lymphatic organ. There is one spleen, and I mentioned there's about 450, 500 lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes are the most numerous. The spleen is the largest, okay? It's in the left upper quadrant of the abdominal cavity. So here is the liver. Here is the right kidney. Here's the left kidney. Here's the gallbladder underneath the liver. And this guy right here is the spleen. So spleen, left upper quadrant, largest lymphatic tissue, organ rather, in the body. What does the spleen do? Red blood cells have a lifespan of about 120 days. Real old red blood cells that are near the end of the life, they get broken down by the spleen. The spleen is also an area in the body where blood is stored. So there's a lot of blood in the spleen. It's highly vascular. Bad part about it's good that you can have extra blood should you need it, right? Let's say you're bleeding, you need extra blood. You can kind of get a blood transfusion from your spleen. But if you injure your spleen, you get stabbed there, or even hard hit in football or something like that, you bleed out very, very, very quickly. And the only treatment for that, generally, if the spleen is cut or lacerated, very rarely can it be repaired. It would take too long to do that, by the way, because you're bleeding so much so quickly. So a splenectomy is done. You don't like to do a splenectomy because not only does the spleen represent a little storage area for extra blood cells, it's also an organ of the immune system, and it helps you fight off things like pneumonia. People who have spleens have less of a chance of coming down with something called pneumococcal pneumonia. People who are asplenic, either they don't have a spleen from birth or they had it surgically removed or whatever, higher incidence of pneumococcal pneumonia among other diseases. Okay. So we're looking at the spleen here, right kidney, left kidney, and here's the spleen. There are areas in the spleen called red pulp, and that's marked in all this teal colored. And then there's white pulp, teal colored on the right side of your screen. All right. Immunity. There is innate immunity, meaning immunity, protection against foreign invaders that you are born with, innate immunity. Then there's also acquired immunity, protection that you pick up along the way as you live your life, okay? Innate immunity helps protect you against pathogenic, disease-causing microorganisms such as viruses, bacteria, and fungi. 3 lines of defense is against pathogens. First line of defense is having intact skin and intact mucous membranes, meaning it's not cracked, it's not cut open. There are no easy pathways for pathogenic microorganisms to make their way in their body. That's the first line of defense, and the best, by the way. Second line of defense, we have some substance in our body. We have leukocytes, white blood cells, infection fighters that circulate. We have macrophages, right? And those are white blood cells turned into tissue cells. And we have proteins that we produce that might kill microorganisms. These proteins are called antibodies. And we have natural killer cells. We have fever. Fever helps to kill a lot of microorganisms as well. There's a reason we have a fever. And then the third line of defense is adaptive immunity. Adaptive immunity. So when a pathogenic microorganism, a bacteria or a virus, enters the body, your immune system kind of takes a snapshot of it and gets ready with its defenses should it ever see that pathogen again. I mentioned at an earlier time that the immune system has a different memory for different types of diseases, different types of microorganisms. But adaptive immunity is how your body adapts to fighting off infections once you've been exposed to an infection, either by coming down with it, or maybe you've been exposed to an infection by getting a vaccination. How does your body adapt the next time out? So innate immunity is what you're born with, right? And adaptive immunity is how your body responds to a pathogen once it has seen it once. So one thing to keep in mind, you just don't develop immunity against infections. You don't develop immunity against bacteria in general, against viruses in general. It's very, very specific. You get a flu shot not to protect you against the common cold, not to protect you against hepatitis C. Very, very specific. The flu shot will help you build up antibodies, help you to adapt against strains of influenza or the flu virus. So adaptive immunity is extremely specific. In terms of our body's innate or inborn or since birth protections, the skin is really, really a great line of defense. If you remember from Anatomy and Physiology 1, we have 3 layers of skin. We have the epidermis, we have the dermis, and then we have the hypodermis or subcutaneous tissue. There, within the epidermis, there's layer after layer after layer after layer of skin cells. Very difficult for bacteria to penetrate into the body from skin that is intact and not cut or ripped or anything like that. Same thing with the mucous membranes, lining your mouth and your throat, etc. On the mucous membranes, it prevents a barrier for bacteria getting and viruses getting into your system. Not a perfect one, but a really good one. And the mucus that the mucous membranes produce, they trap these microorganisms. Obviously, not all of them all the time. And then the mucous membranes also produce a substance that helps to destroy bacterial cell walls. Okay, leukocytes, white blood cells, macrophages. Those are kind of a type of leukocyte that will undergo transformation as it moves out of the bloodstream 1 to 3 days after coming into being into the tissue. 5 types of leukocytes. Leukocytes are WBCs, white blood cells, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Those are the granulocytic, and I'm making granules or speckles. Then we have lymphocytes and monocytes, agranulocytic. Okay, good. Let me erase all this. As much as I can. Neutrophils. We're talking about a lot. We're talking about lymph vessels, and we're talking about lymph nodes and tonsils and spleens and the thymus, right? And we're talking about this chapter again, white blood cells. The most numerous type of white blood cells are neutrophils, and they serve to kill bacteria. When you have a bacterial infection and your blood is tested, your neutrophil count would be elevated. And the neutrophils will release some enzymes that will help to break down bacteria. Eosinophils, they guard us against, they help guard the body against parasites, worms and things like that, things you find maybe freshwater swimming. And also they are elevated in number during an allergic reaction. Okay. Basophils, these are white blood cells. Are they granulocytic or agranulocytic? Think about it for a second. Pause me if you need to. They are granulocytic. Neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, 3 types of granulocytic white blood cells. They basically make some chemicals that help other white blood cells get there. Leukotrienes they will release. What does that do? It tells the neutrophils, hey, come on over here. I got some leukotrienes that are very attractive for you. They release histamine. You heard of antihistamines. Histamine dilates blood vessels. The more dilated the blood vessel is in an area that needs it, the more white blood cells it can get there. And then they also produce something called heparin. Heparin we can produce in a laboratory and give it to patients, but heparin inhibits blood clotting. Basophils. Lymphocytes. There are different classes of lymphocytes. In this course, we'll deal with 3. T lymphocytes, that accounts for 80% of the circulating lymphocytes. Out of the lymphocytes, 80% of them are T lymphocytes. Why T? Because they mature in the thymus. Then we have B lymphocytes. They do a lot of things. They're best known for creating antibodies. And then we have about 5% NK cells. You remember what NK stands for? Not North Korea. Natural killer cells. Other white blood cells. Monocytes, and associated with monocytes are macrophages or macrophages. Monocytes will circulate in the blood for 24 to 72 hours, then they'll leave the bloodstream, go into connective tissue, and at that point they're called macrophages. And macrophages seek out pathogens to eat up. Yeah, some of them are wandering macrophages, and then there's fixed macrophages that they're not going to go out looking for bacteria, but they're going to wait for bacteria to come to them so they can help destroy them. So here's a depiction of macrophages. And we have some antimicrobial proteins. What are they? Proteins that inhibit or slow down or suppress the reproduction of these bacteria that have come into our body, these pathogenic, meaning disease-causing bacteria, these pathogenic viruses that come into our body. And 2 families of these antimicrobial proteins. Number 1 is the interferon family. Number 2 is something called the complement system. Oops, I don't know what I just did. Interferons. Cells that are infected by a virus, if we're lucky, and we usually are, they will secrete or put out these chemicals called interferons. The cell that's infected, these interferons don't help them at all. They don't help with that cell's infection, but it can help neighboring cells from getting infected. And what they do is they'll bind to receptors for them on neighboring cells. So the cell next door will have a receptor for interferon. The cell that's infected with the virus will produce interferon, send it out. The cells next door have receptors for them, come on in, and interferons help prevent the spread of infection from an already infected cell into one that is not yet infected. Okay. What do interferons do? Well, they alert neighboring cells, hey, there is a pathogenic disease-causing microorganism, in particularly viruses, in the neighborhood. It's an alert system. So it helps to break down the genetic material of the virus so it can't reproduce. The interferons will also activate natural killer cells and macrophages. And when the natural killer cells are activated, they also help destroy malignant cells. And when I say malignant, I mean this. So keep in mind, your immune system is not just to protect you against infectious diseases. It also serves to protect you against cancer. So that's interferons. How about the complement system? These are proteins, many of them, that help contribute both to innate immunity, meaning what you're born with, and then adaptive immunity, what your immune system learns as your body goes throughout life. And these complement proteins are made by the liver, and they circulate through the blood in an inactive form. What activates them? A pathogenic microorganism. That flips the switch. So complement helps destroy pathogens. We have a lot of things working together, right? We haven't even talked about antibodies yet. We have a lot of things working together to help keep us infection-free. Complement has 4 ways in which it can help. Complement will help produce inflammation in an area. We think of inflammation as bad, but it isn't always bad. Inflammation means warmth. Why warmth? That's because there's more blood flow. More blood flow, we can get more white blood cells to the area, that sort of thing. Helps clear the immune system. It helps with phagocytosis, right? Eating up of these infectious microorganisms. And cytolysis. Cyte or cyto, cell, lysis, break apart, kaboom, right? We saw that with the immune system. There's different ways to activate complement. I'm not going to discuss that, but complement are circulating proteins in the immune system that help destroy pathogenic, meaning disease-causing microorganisms.
Good day.
And we're done for the day. Thank you.